So I'm really pleased to be speaking to you this morning, and we're going to be discussing a number of topics which are focused on supporting parents of children with education, health and care plans in a school setting. So, like I said, my name's Liz Murray and I'm the founder of Spotlight Education Support, which is a SEND-focused training, consultancy and advocacy service. So I work with schools, supporting them to enhance, improve their SEND provision. I support SENCOs, work very actively with SENCOs and head teachers. And I'm also an assistant head teacher and SENCO, which is a role that I job share now because I obviously have my business to focus on as well. And I'm currently, I've got experience working in both the independent sector and also the state sector, the primary, the secondary setting as an assistant head and SENCO. And in my current role, I'm working in a secondary mainstream and a job share in the same role. So this is an area that I'm really, really passionate about, and particularly in terms of making sure that parents are aware of their rights, their opportunities, in terms of making sure that their children get the best possible provision through their education, health and care plan. So let's just move this on, and I'm hoping that people can see that. I've got Sandra here from Seashell Trust, who's behind the scenes, but she will come on and interrupt me if there's any sort of issues. So I can't hear or see any of you actually, which is a little bit strange, but if you do want to let us know if something's not working or you can't hear or whatever, you can put a message into the chat and Sandra's going to be monitoring that for me, and she'll stop me and interrupt me if she needs to, if we need to respond to something. So your microphone should be muted so that we don't get any sort of feedback from your machines. And I'd like to encourage you to participate. So I'm going to be asking you for some feedback at one point in the presentation, and the way to do that is to just type your feedback into the chat function in Zoom. So I hope everybody knows where that is. But that will be really helpful if you can do that, because it just will make things a little bit more interactive and engaging. There's also going to be an opportunity for some questions and answers. Now, just to say about this, that it would be very difficult for me to respond to very individual questions. So if you can try and keep your questions sort of obviously reasonably general. Obviously it's going to apply to you and your situation, perhaps your child's situation, but we've got to be really, really aware of sort of confidentiality, so don't share any personal details please in the chat. And also just to say that, obviously I am a SENCO, but I'm not a solicitor, I'm not a SEND solicitor. So we will be looking at some aspects of SEND law because you need to know some of that, but I won't be able to advise in a sort of a legal manner. So there's going to be two opportunities across the period of time that we've got this morning. Now we've got from sort of 10 o'clock this morning, where we've just started, up until about 12 o'clock if we need it. We might not use all of that time. We've allowed that amount of time so that there is enough time for people to ask questions. So there's going to be two opportunities during the webinar to ask questions. And again, the way to do that is to put those questions into the chat, and Sandra is going to then come on and read those out to me, and we'll discuss them. I can't promise that I'll be able to answer every single question that you may have, but certainly we'll do our best with that. Okay, I have there on this slide, in the housekeeping slide, also just given you a little signpost there to an organisation who I think are very good, Sen Legal. You've got the website link there. I'm sure that Seashell Trust can send this presentation out to you afterwards, and they are really friendly, approachable, very sensible sort of solicitors who specialise in the SEND side of things. There's also an awful lot of information on their website which I find very useful, so they might be somewhere to go to if you've got a specific SEND legal question. Okay, so I'm moving on now to our goals for this webinar. So really, my goals this morning for us are to signpost some key information for you. So I will provide you with anything that any sort of useful links or resources that I think would be useful for you as parents. I'm going to be really thinking about in the real world strategies. Because so often, you know, when we look at the SEND Code of Practice, or we might look at the Children and Families Act, you know, it lays it out in black and white. But what actually happens in the real world, in practice? What are some common sense strategies and solutions and ways of working to make sure that you are getting the best experience for yourselves as families, and ultimately for your child? And that's working with the school, and it's also working with the local authority. So it really is, I'm going to try and focus today quite a lot on some really, you know, just some different perspectives so we can think about the best ways of working together. And what I'm hoping is that this presentation this morning will really empower you as parents to work in partnership with the other stakeholders. So often when I work with parents, I hear that they feel that there's a real power imbalance between, you know, from their perspective, their role as a parent, when they're working either with the school or with the local authority. And I really want to try and address that today, because I don't believe that it has to be that way at all. And I think that you know, it's really important actually that as parents you see the value in your expertise, and you know, the power that you bring to that dynamic, that relationship that you have with those other stakeholders, and also that the dynamic that your child brings too. Now, before we get into all of this, just to let you know, we've got a lot of people on this webinar this morning. I think we've got about 100 people, and they're from all over the country. So from working within different local authorities and a range of different types of school settings. So we've got people who have got children who are in a special school setting. We've got people who are who've got children in primary, secondary, and the mainstream. And we've also actually got a few professionals, I believe, joining us this morning too. So welcome to those professionals too. And I was really pleased to hear that we did have some professionals joining us this morning, because obviously, you know, that's really important in terms of what we're going to be covering and thinking about the perspectives that we're going to be bringing to that. Okay, so let's move into. Okay, so these are the areas that are going to be discussed this morning. So what to expect at an annual review. We're going to cover provision. We're going to think about different types of transitions that are, you know, key transitions for your child. We're going to think about the principles of effective co-production and what that feels like, and how we can make that happen, and the local authority role. Now, I'm going to be dipping in and out of these areas, so it's not they're not sort of you know, one after the other and that's it, each section's finished, because it doesn't really work like that. They're all interlinked. I will move through all of these different areas, but you'll find that we're going back and forth a little bit as we go along. And I've built in opportunities for you to ask any questions. Okay, so annual reviews and what you should know. Oh, sorry, that's just gone. Okay, so obviously some of the key areas, if your child has got an annual review, if your child's got an education, health and care plan, okay, so first of all, your child's education, health and care plan must be reviewed annually. That's why they're called annual reviews. But unfortunately, I quite often work with families and also with school SENCOs, sometimes new school SENCOs who've just gone into a role and are finding that actually these important annual reviews have not happened as they should have done. And that is absolutely key. It's clearly stated in the Children and Families Act. I've included a reference there for you. Just to be clear though, it is the local authority's responsibility to ensure that these meetings happen. Okay, so the local authority, whichever local authority you're in, is responsible for maintaining and upholding that education, health and care plan. So they need to make sure that those reviews have happened. They can request that the school, and in the legislation it says that the school head teacher is requested to make sure that these reviews are, these EHCPs are reviewed annually. But as you will know, if you've got a child in school, usually it's the school actually who takes the lead on arranging these. But the point is that it is the local authority's responsibility. So in terms of what you should be able to expect as a parent, you should have 2 weeks notice of the annual review. Okay, and again, that's set out in the legislation clearly. Okay, so if you shouldn't ever have a situation where you're being phoned up or receiving an email saying, right, the review is tomorrow or the review is next week. And the reason for that is because then you have got proper time to think about and prepare for that annual review. And I would suggest that as a parent, as a family, you do prepare for those reviews. And I'll talk you through that a little bit more as we go into the presentation. The other thing that you should receive 2 weeks prior to the annual review are a set of reports. Okay, so in fact, it's best practice, and you'll know this if you're working with a school SENCO, who's really organised, to let parents know quite a bit further in advance than the 2 weeks. So at my school, we try to let parents know about a month in advance. Okay, and then 2 weeks before that, we make sure that all of the reports that are required are sent out to them, and that's so they can have a really good read through and process that and think about from their perspective how that links up and what they want to bring and what they want to suggest at the annual review. So quite often I get asked, what sort of reports should you expect? Well, I would suggest that you would receive some sort of a progress report from school, and that it depends obviously on the school setting, on your child's targets and outcomes that are set in the EHCP. But basically you should be receiving some sort of a report from school to have a look at, which is linked to their progress. Okay, the other things that you might see a specific report from some of their individual teachers if your child is in the secondary setting. You might see a report from a teaching assistant or learning support assistant who supports your child regularly, because obviously they're working with them in quite a close manner and on a day-to-day basis. You should also, if it's appropriate, see specialist reports. So, for example, if your child's been working with a speech and language therapist, it's best practice for that speech and language therapist to write a report prior to the annual review. It will depend a little bit on the situation, but if it's an NHS speech and language therapist and provided by the local authority as part of your child's provision, certainly that should be provided. And obviously there are other specialists that work with young people, such as occupational therapists, clinical psychologists, etc. Okay. The other thing that's really important at this stage is that you should also be asked to provide your own views, your parent views, and your child should be enabled or asked to given an opportunity to provide their views. And different settings do this in different ways, and different local authorities have different paperwork, which isn't hugely helpful. It would be brilliant if we had a national set of paperwork that everybody was using. And something that parents quite often say to me is, but you know, I've got a lot to say, and this paperwork has got, you know, like maybe 5 questions and a tiny little bit of space for me to write. What I always say is, don't worry about it. You don't have to use their paperwork if you don't want to. That's not statutory. If you want to go away and write it all out, type it out or write it out yourself in using your own format, you want to tailor it to what you want to say, that's absolutely fine. There's no problem with that at all. What really is important is that you are able to put your views across. Okay. So who will be invited to your annual review? Okay, well, obviously you should be invited, and the child or young person should be invited. Now, again, it very much depends, doesn't it, on your child or young person's specific needs and how comfortable they would feel participating in their annual review. It might be that your child is consulted with prior to the annual review, if that's more appropriate, and they're given an opportunity to tell their views to somebody who records those. Certainly in the secondary mainstream setting where I work at the moment, I like young people to attend the review. If not the entire thing, then certainly a part of it. I would always talk to them about it beforehand, check that they felt comfortable, always mindful of the number of adults in the room and how that's going to feel, but very much the intention should be to make that young person, you know, feel a part of that and empowered and enabled to be able to participate. Again, if you've got a primary age child, obviously you're going to have to think about whether or not that's going to be helpful. But one of the reasons why I think it's really important, if you can, to have the child or young person advocating their own thoughts and perspectives as part of the review process, is because they are the centre really of this plan, and they are part of co-production, which I'm going to be talking about later on in the presentation. And if we're not careful, as you know, well-meaning as we are, both as parents and as professionals, we can filter the child's perspective through our own adult lens, and actually it's important to hear what they have got to say. So I'd really you know, encourage you to think about, you know, ways in which your child could be involved. And if the school isn't suggesting that your child is involved, think about you know, how that can happen. I apologise, my dog barking in the background here. Hopefully I won't have a child walking across the screen in a moment, but you never know. Okay, so other people who would be invited to the review, obviously we've got, so the official guidance talks about the head teacher facilitating and running the annual review, and again, it will depend on the setting, the size of the setting, the type of setting, but it's not, in a lot of settings, especially mainstream, as you will know, there will be a school Senko, and that's absolutely fine for them to be the person who is organising and running the reviews, and in fact that is generally what I would expect to see. You also, in some settings, might not even have the Senko running the annual review. Now that's more unusual, but again, it does depend on the situation. So for example, I worked for a short time in a special school, and all of the LSAs, quite often LSAs at that school ran annual reviews, and they were trained to do so. That was the key. So they were trained to do that, and they were an appropriate representative for that review, to run that review. If you felt as a parent that, you know, you didn't have the appropriate person running the review, then I think that that's important to say. And I would say in the majority of cases, it's going to be the SENCO or the head teacher, and that's who it should be. But there are exceptions to that. The local authority caseworker, and again, there's different terminology for these roles. Hopefully you know who that person is. It would be, you don't know who that person is for your child, your school. It would be good to find out and to have their email address in case you need it, but they should be invited to annual reviews. Now, just to say, I mean, I've been a SENCO for many, many years, and we have always invited the local authority caseworker to the annual reviews, and there are very few that attend all of them. What you quite often can find, and you'll know this if you're a parent who's used to this process already, is that quite often you can go for a number of years without seeing anybody from the local authority, and then suddenly at a key transition point, so for example from primary to secondary or secondary to post-16, someone will come along from the local authority. And it can feel a little bit daunting actually when that happens, and for yourself as a parent, and sometimes also if you've not got a very experienced SENCO, for the SENCO too, and people can get themselves into a bit of a fluster over it. But it's actually really positive if you can have your local authority caseworker attending that review, and especially I would say if you're going to be looking at if you're going to be suggesting any amendments to the education, health and care plan. As a parent, if you can push the local authority caseworker to attend the review, then that is a very powerful thing. And you know, as long as you're working with the school and with the school SENCO, you know, you're all working together towards the same aim. Quite often that is a way to ensure that those amendments happen sort of first time that you want them to. You're not having to sort of battle for them. Other people who might be invited are any healthcare professionals and any, if appropriate, social care officers. And you know, this isn't an exhaustive list, but these are the key people who should attend. Okay, so at the review, a couple of really important things. Obviously, reviewing the child or young person's progress towards achieving their outcomes specified in the education, health and care plan. This needs to be done. Quite often we get into, you know, really positive and interesting conversations, you know, about the child's progress, what happened last week at school, you know, friendship groups, all of these things, and lots of these things are going to be highly relevant. But you must make sure in the annual review, I mean, the SENCO needs to make sure, but it's worth you being aware that you've actually looked at the outcomes that have been set down in writing in that education, health and care plan, and that they have been reviewed, and that it's a school's responsibility to sort of take the minutes and write a report reflecting the conversation, the actual annual review. But ultimately that report then goes to the local authority, and it's their responsibility to amend and update and reissue the updated EHCP. Okay, and there's a distinction there. All right, I'm going to talk about that a little bit more in a moment. Other things I think that are important to discuss is that the support provision needs to be very specific, and I'm going to talk about that a bit more later on in relation to funding, but that's important both for your, you know, most importantly for your child, for you to know exactly what the support is going to look like, for the school to understand exactly what they need to put in place, and for the local authority to agree that that should be funded and to provide that funding and any additional support. For example, if speech and language therapy is required, it's the local authority's responsibility to provide that, not the schools. So the outcomes need to be adjusted and updated as part of that review process. Worth knowing as well that from year 9 and beyond, the meeting must consider the provision required for preparation for adulthood. So really thinking about these independent learning and living skills that your child is going to need. And again, the school will provide the pre-reports, and the school will also provide a report or the minutes of the meeting, and then they will send that to the local authority, and they need to send those minutes or report, whatever they call that, to the local authority within 2 weeks, by 2 weeks of that annual review having happened. So what should ideally happen is that at the end of the review, whoever's been chairing it should say to you, okay, so we're going to write up everything that we've discussed today, and we'll send it to you to check, and then we'll send that to the local authority. Now, if they don't do that, perhaps ask them, when will I receive the minutes or the report reflecting this meeting? Because you need to have time to read that through carefully, check that you feel that the conversation has been represented before it goes to the local authority, because then once it's with the local authority, it's over to them to update that EHCP. And you don't want to be quibbling with the school on, you know, whether or not this was said or that was said. And you want to make sure that you and the school are in agreement about what's going to the local authority. So that's just worth being aware of. Okay. Right. So the local authority's responsibility at this point is then once they've got the EHCP annual review report or minutes, then it's there. They've got 4 weeks then, okay, to write back to you and let you know three possible options. Okay, so it might be they're going to leave the education, health and care plan in its current format. Okay, it might be that they're going to amend the education, health and care plan. Now, if you've asked for some amendments, hopefully they're going to make those amendments as you and the school have requested. Okay, or they could say that they're going to cease to maintain the education, health and care plan. So basically, it's worth you knowing that you have got an automatic right to appeal if they don't amend it when you've asked them to. If they propose amendments you haven't agreed, and you need to watch out for that. And also, obviously, watch out for any suggestion of ceasing to maintain if that is not what you've requested. And when I say you've got an automatic right to appeal, that means you've got an automatic right to appeal at a tribunal. And you know, there are different ways to sort of handle these situations. Also, just to be sort of just I suppose to be sort of noticing and thinking about when those times are that this might happen. I mean, it's worth being aware that local authorities have also had, you know, significant budget cuts. Funding is you know, is an issue, and so sometimes what you can find is that local authorities will try to cease to maintain a plan or to reduce the funding provision, and often the timing when that could happen tends to be sort of around key transition time, so primary to secondary, sometimes secondary to post-16. Just worth keeping an eye open and really, you know, unfortunately it's not unusual for that to happen. So I would say, again, being very, very clear, you know, in those annual review minutes and reports that you and the school are sending to the local authority, and being aware that basically education healthcare plans are very evidence-based. So, for example, if you are saying that, you know, your child has made really good progress, that's wonderful, and that's really good to be celebrating that. But it's important that the school is evidencing how the child's made that progress. So, you know, what support has been in place in order for them to make that progress, and does that support need to continue for your child to continue progressing at the same trajectory, for example? Because if it's over celebrated and it's not evidence what's been required, then in some ways that is an opening for somebody to say, oh well, is this funding actually required? This child is making amazing progress. It's a balance. Okay, so what does a good review look like? And just a little little warning, I'm going to be asking you to participate in a minute. So if you're, I hope you're not zoning off as I sort of drone on into, I can't see any of you. It's all a bit strange. But I'm going to be asking you in a minute to think about what a good review feels like. I hope you've experienced a good review, and if not a good review, what does a review that's not good feel like? Okay, so just be starting to think about that. Right, so what does a good review look like? Well, these are some key things I think are really important, and if these are not happening in your reviews that you're attending at school, you know, it might be worth having a bit of a conversation about what would really work for you as a family. Okay, and that different people run them in different ways, so this isn't, you know, it's not one size fits all, but these are some of the key elements that I think need to be part of a good review. So obviously the pre-meeting information has gone out 2 weeks in advance. You've had a chance to look at it, and you've had a chance to formulate your own views and quite possibly return them to the school in advance, because that's helpful for them to be able to look at your views, read those through, and again, you know, just sort of process that rather than just in the moment. All right. Also, I always think it's really helpful, and any professionals that are watching this right now might want to take notes, to do a quick accessibility check for parents. So making sure that parents are comfortable to attend the review. Do they need a representative with them? Do they need any support? I mean, the other thing at the moment during this lockdown period is that all of my reviews are now virtual. And that isn't always, you know, brilliant for everybody. So one of the things that I like to do is to give parents a quick call ahead of time and just sort of talk them through how it's going to go, what's it's going to be like. And I think it's really important that everybody feels that they're able to participate, they're comfortable, and that it's a positive space to be having those conversations. There should be clear introductions, so that you know who everybody is in the meeting or in the room, and if your child's attending, that they do too. One of the first things I always like to do is to really focus on celebrating the child. So there's always something, no matter how things are going, that's positive. Hopefully there's lots of positive things. But focus on really celebrating the child, and you know, just starting with some positivity. And then actually I quite like to start with the child's views, because the point of the review is it's about them, and it's about their provision, and it's about their progress and how they feel and how it's working for them. So that's a really nice way to begin. Then after that, I like to go to the parents' view. And if I've been able to see that feedback in advance, it's better, because I'm able then as a SENCO to really sort of try and perhaps dig a little bit deeper and find out a bit more about what that parent is feeling, be it positive or be it not. I think the other thing that's really important at the review is to really clarify the current provision and the support that's been in place and that is in place, and really think about how this is working. So what progress has been made, discussing whether that provision needs to stay in place just as it is and stay in the plan, or what adaptations might need to be made or amendments might need to be made. And this also could potentially link to funding, because if something different or additional is required, you know, it might be that you're able to adapt that within the current funding structure, but it might be that actually you need to go back to the local authority and say, well, actually we'd like to do this is the reason why. Again, all clearly evidence-based, and usually has to be costed out as well, to demonstrate why that's required. And then you'd be thinking about achievements related again to these EHCP outcomes. Okay, so really important, and to update those and thinking about the next academic year. Now, hopefully, you know, your annual review is obviously a statutory meeting. It needs to happen, but hopefully this isn't the only meeting or conversation that you're having with the school, you know, this academic year. It should be an ongoing dialogue. And obviously it's going to depend on the child, it's going to depend on the level of support they need and the level of support that a family needs. But, you know, hopefully this isn't the only conversation. But at this particular meeting, at this review, you need to make sure that these the statutory outcomes are reviewed. And then after that meeting, the school as I've said, will write the report up. They'll should circulate that to all stakeholders to read through and check and agree, and then it's sent to the local authority within 2 weeks. And again, just to stress, you know, it's the school's responsibility to do that, but obviously if as a parent, you know, you hold on to those review notes for a period of time, you're allowing the school a little bit less, you know, it's a tight deadline basically, so you all need to work together to meet that. Okay, so that's what a good review, elements of a good review and what they look like. Now I'd like to ask you, so what does a good review feel like? So what do you think? All right, and also, you know, are there any elements of a good review that you've experienced and that I haven't mentioned, because I think that's useful for people as well. And so I'm just going to pause for a moment and give you a chance to type your comments into the chat. Oh, and actually I can see some of these. Let's have a look. Right. Yes, I can see some various questions. Well, let's see. Right, so I've got somebody saying, yeah, the child leads feedback plus the child's opinion. Absolutely. So one of the things, yeah, feels like the child or young person is at the centre. I think that it really is the key, isn't it? I mean, one of the things that I sometimes do, because I also think it's this balance again of it being quite, it can be quite nerve-wracking for a child, young person, you know, sitting in a meeting with quite a few adults. And so sometimes what I will do is I will get their learning support assistant, or sometimes I might ask their parents to go through some questions with them ahead of time and write down their answers. And then I might say to them, do they want to read their answers out to us? Or do they want me to read them, or their mum or dad to read them? Because that way it's a good way of getting their views out into the arena without them feeling you know, nervous or uncomfortable. Less use of professional acronyms. Yeah, definitely. And you know, the thing about this as well is that they're all different from different areas in the UK. I recently, well, moved about 2.5 years ago from London to Stockport, which is where I am now, and all of the acronyms, many of the acronyms were different, so I've had to learn them, and it's so confusing. It really is. Being listened to, not taken seriously. Let's see. People are saying they had to request the paperwork. A good review feels like you've been given a good opportunity to air your views. You feel they've been fully taken on board. That's David. Thank you, David. Agree. When you have a good review, you feel comfortable expressing your view. There's a chance to speak and listen on both sides of the table. You feel like you're talking about the same child. Totally agree. Feel as though we're in the room. There's a can-do attitude. Absolutely. Parents should feel they understand how their child's progressing and the support in place to enable further progression. Yeah, definitely. That discussion about support needs to be really specific. Honesty from all really helped in our review. Absolutely. Do you know, I've attended some reviews sometimes where I've had there's been a really positive SENCO chairing the meeting, but sometimes sugarcoating what's actually happening, and that's not helpful either. You need to have a really honest discussion. How many times do parents need to meet with the school during the academic year? Well, the Code of Practice suggests three times, so once a term. But that could include, you know, a parents' evening. It could include a chat on the phone. But if you'd like, you know, a more formal sit-down review, you can obviously request that with the school. I'm going to talk a little bit later about different types of school settings and considering what sort of support you need as parents as well, because, you know, if you choose a school that's got large numbers of children with complex needs, and in a mainstream school, for example, you know, you might be choosing a school that's got a very good provision and is very experienced at working with children with complex needs, but you're also quite possibly putting yourself into a situation where you've got a SENCO who's not got as much time, and they may well have a team, but you sort of need to think about that a little bit in terms of the support that you require, because if you're somebody who requires, you know, a lot of meetings with the SENCO, you might not get that in that situation, so you might be better off looking at a different setting. And all of these things are you know, worth considering, because again, this is in the real world. It's not, you know, in a fake world. Okay, so a review feels good when it captures the child's positives, if not specific outcomes. It's good when the attendees are open and honest with you about the good and the bad. Yeah. Haven't received one after review, don't know what it looks like. I wonder if that's the report. Oh, haven't received the EHCP maybe. Working with the schools and other professionals to look at possible assessments that may help support the child's outcomes. For example, dyslexia needs to be collaborative, child-centric. Oh, at secondary school, I haven't ever experienced a good review, only now at the end of year 10 into 11 is the EHCP from primary being updated. That's terrible. I'm so sorry to hear that. Parent and child feel confident they've been listened to, should be inclusive and non-judgmental, feels great when it's well organised. Yeah. All the professionals around the table at the same time. Yeah. More in place for children who feel uncomfortable to attend. Yeah, exactly. So there's some suggestions, hopefully, from this session today that you might be able to take to the school. Let's see. Format of the plans isn't great. Yeah, it really helps if all parties understand what the different sections mean, why it's important, the right information, the right sections. Okay, this is a really tricky one, and this is what I mean about there not being universal paperwork. It would be so helpful if there was paperwork that was used by every local authority. So I've worked as a SENCO with probably 7 different local authorities, and all of the paperwork is different. Some of it is really not good at all, and some of it's much better. Okay. One way you feel you have to challenge or fight for the needs of the child when it's evident the needs are visible. The reports are available, parents included. Feedback on child should be measurable. Just hearing that they're doing great gives a parent little to see progress. Absolutely, that's right. Walk away feeling positive about how your child is doing. These are some brilliant comments. Should the All About Me be updated each year with the annual review? You can, yeah, I mean, again, that's going to depend on local authority paperwork. Not all of them may include that. But if the child's needs have changed, if the child has changed, then yes, I would suggest that you're requesting amendments. Smart objectives would be refreshing, yes. Though some SENCOs have been trained to do smart outcomes, and certainly that's what I always try to do. They do need to be specific and measurable, achievable, etc. Okay, so thank you for that. Some really helpful comments. I think we're all on the same page in this space, even though I can't see or hear any of you. Okay, so I hope everybody's okay. I'm going to move on. All right, I had a short break there. Right, so this is something that I think is quite useful. So when you get the, I'm not going to click on it now in case it all goes wrong, but when you get the presentation slides, if you click on the image that I put here, it should take you directly to it. It's on the EHCP website. Lots of you will know about EHCP. I'm going to provide some links at the end of the presentation to some organisations that I feel offer some really useful resources. But this, I think, is really good because it basically it sets out everything that I'm talking about today, probably a little bit more, in terms of the EHCP process and the statutory guidelines, and also that it links it to the regulations and the section in the Code of Practice. And if you are somebody who, unfortunately, and it looks like from some of those comments, isn't, having a positive experience and hasn't received the statutory paperwork, you can use this to write to your local authority, because you can actually link it to the key areas in the Children and Families Act and in the Code of Practice. Okay, so I think this is a really useful document, and again, it just sets it out for you really clearly. It's about 2 pages long in total, so have a look at that, and it's helpful. Okay, right. So I want to now talk to you about provision in an education, health and care plan. And again, provision is going to look very different depending on your child's needs. And I get a little bit frustrated sometimes with schools, actually, when we talk about provision, and it seems that sometimes people just think, oh, it's just about having TA or LSA support. It doesn't just have to be that. That is probably the most common type of provision in a mainstream school. But the funding does not have to be used for that. It can be used for other things. But there are considerations that as a parent you need to be thinking about and aware of in order to sort of get the best out of the provision for your child. So first of all, in section F of the Education, Health and Care Plan, I don't know if you've got your child's Education, Health and Care Plan in front of you. If you have, it might be worth flipping to section F and having a look. The Code of Practice is very, very clear. It says that section F should be specific and quantified, okay, and this includes, should include the funding, okay. Now, when it's saying it's specific and quantified, what I mean by that is it should say exactly what your child is going to receive. Now, in the past, so sort of prior to the Code of Practice being updated, you may not know it was updated. It was updated in 2015, which is obviously a little while ago now. But there were a lot of previous statements for special education or need, which became before they were then turned into education, health and care plans. You don't necessarily need to know this, but it's useful context. And on those statements of special educational needs, the way in which it stated provision was quite often say something like 25 hours of TA support for a child, okay? But it didn't, and it should also include funding or a funding band for that, which should equate to those 25 hours. And then what happened was that the Code of Practice came in, and really what should happen from there is that, you shouldn't just have something like 25 hours of TA support without the clear funding there in place to pay for that, okay? And quite often that is still what's happening. So if you look at section F of your EHCP, your child's EHCP, and you just see that, you know, that's not enough, it's not adequate, because what can then have happened, or what can happen, is that, you know, it says 25 hours, you're thinking as a parent that's what my child should get, but actually the school are not getting the funding to pay for that. So, you know, and it's not your job as a parent to sort that out, but it kind of is your job as a parent. You've got the power as a parent to hold the local authority to account. Okay, and clearly, you know, if it says 25 hours and then the school are getting £3,000, they're not going to be able to provide that. Okay, so it is a little bit of a sticky issue, this, and it's going to depend on the individual situation, but I think it's worth you being aware of it as a parent. Okay, I'm going to talk a bit more about specific provision as we go through the presentation, but you know, it should be extremely clear in section F what's being provided. Okay, and if it's not, or if it doesn't make sense, so quite often I'll read EHCPs, and in section F there'll be like a shopping list of things that the child should be receiving, and then next to it just says school TA provide, and sometimes that's clearly not going to be possible. So for example, it might be, so one example is if they put salt in there, well actually it's the local authority's responsibility to provide that salt. Okay, sometimes I'll see things where, you know, parents are asking for a specific dyslexic specialist, for example, if you've got a child with complex dyslexia. Well, the local authority have to agree to fund that if that is the case. Okay, the school might then recruit somebody, but again, and also that funding needs to be in the zone of reality. Okay, so you know, it's you know, schools have to factor in on costs and all of that sort of thing. So you know, it's worth as a parent being really thinking about actually, you know, what is the funding, what is in the provision, talking to the school about how that's going to happen. And again, I'll talk a bit more about provision and working with schools on getting the best for your child as we go through the presentation. So also just to say actually on section F is it must be delivered. Now during the last lockdown, as you know probably, there was a sort of a legislation that came in temporarily to say that section F didn't all have to be delivered, but this time around that hasn't happened. So even though it might look different, the provision for your child should still be going ahead in some form. So just to give you an example, I've got remote speech and language therapy happening for some of the children in my school. Okay, I've got we offer Alexia provision, for example, for some of the children. We've got that happening remotely. Okay, I've even got motor skills happening remotely. Obviously, parents are having to work with us, but we are making sure that we are providing what is in section F of the EHCPs. Okay, for our young people, and that should be happening for your children as well. All right, and if it's not, you know, it's okay to contact the school and talk to them about how they're going to do that. All right, now it's going to look different because of this situation, but if, you know, working together, that should happen. All right, so at a transfer stage, when I'm talking about transfer or transition, we tend to use these words fairly interchangeably. I'm talking about, for example, going from through different key stages, or particularly those key transitions, early years into primary, primary to secondary, secondary to post-16. So the review should really consider what's going to be needed in the next stage or setting. Okay, and you know, that's really important. Sometimes local authorities don't always respond to that, and they do have to by law. All right, and again, the funding amount is important, as this is what pays for the additional support for your child. Now, I'm not going to get into this too much in terms of the nominal £6,000, but basically all schools are supposed to have, or not have, they're supposed to find £6,000 for every child that is on SEND support, and that's like the first stage, obviously. and that money is supposed to be used to support those children. All right. So if your child has got an education, health and care plan, the local authority will assume that the first £6,000 is paid for by the school, and then the local authority provide a top up. All right. So let's say, for example, that your child should be in receipt of £15,000 to pay for their provision. Okay. The first £6,000 paid for by the school will receive £11,000. Okay. Now, this is quite a difficult one, because in the real world, school budgets have been significantly slashed. Different schools in different areas receive different amounts of funding, depending on where they are, depending on how many children they've got from disadvantaged backgrounds. There's all sorts of formulas that are applied. You know, and some schools actually only receive about £4,000 per child to cater for everything. That's like the school facilities, the teachers, etc., etc. Okay, and yeah, so it's a difficult one. It's not, and that money is not ring-fenced by the school or by the government, and there's no extra provided by the government if the school has got a higher number of children who are, say, on SEND support, or a higher number of children with education, health and care plans. So, you know, schools are under a lot of pressure. All right, which is why I think it's really important that when you're working with schools and the local authority, you're very, very specific and evidence-based in terms of what your child needs, so that you can try and get as much funding as is needed to support your child. Okay. Right, so yeah, I've just talked about some of this already. I think the other thing to think about with funding for a school, from a school perspective, is, you know, schools have to plan ahead. All right, that's why that really schools should receive. So say, for example, year 6 is coming into year 7. At this point in the academic year, really a school should have received the consultations for those children, so they can be considering them, responding, and then any children that are coming to their school for September, they've got adequate time to plan, because obviously they may need to recruit staff. Okay, that's the key thing. That's not something that can happen immediately, and because or without any lead-in time, and because you know, school budgets are so tight at the moment. You know, most schools don't have any sort of leeway or flexibility with that. They can't just get another member of staff. They don't have another member of staff with extra time to play with. Okay, so it's worth you being aware of that, and again, we're going to talk about sort of timings for annual reviews in a minute, and just being aware of some of the deadlines for that. Also, think about, from a school's perspective, you know, they've got to provide provision for a whole cohort. So it's not just a matter of, okay, well, I've got, you know, student A with an EHC who's bringing in this much money, I'm going to now hire a learning support assistant for 15 hours for that person. Obviously, what schools have to do is they've got to work in a very efficient way. So they need to, they've got to piece all of that together and then work out how many staff they need, what sort of specialisms or experience they need for particular children or young people, and then they need to put that together. So it's not something that can just, you know, happen overnight or very quickly. And sometimes schools are put in very difficult positions by local authorities, placing children late. And there can be lots of reasons for that. But if your child is placed late for whatever reason, which is probably no fault of your own either, really try and work with the school and understand their perspective as well, because again, it will help your relationship going forward if you're able to work together in that way. So I'm just trying to think if there's anything else. And yes, I think the other thing to say on this is that if, you know, working with, I mean, I've worked with parents, you know, for years and years and years. I'm a parent myself too, you know, with a child at school, and a proactive, supportive parent who understands their rights with an education healthcare plan and working with local authorities can make a huge difference, because if parents actually have more sway with the local authority than SENCOs do, and that schools do, and if together you decide that, you know, your child needs a little bit more funding, so some sort of provision can be put in place that you feel is going to make a big difference to your child, then if you put that, you know, together between you, sometimes it might be that then you follow up with an email because the Senko's not having any joy because they've put that through, and that can sometimes have a lot more impact. So that's worth thinking about too. And I'm hoping that as I'm talking to you in this way, you know, and obviously at the moment I've got my Senko hat on, I'm helping you to sort of reframe that relationship, because with schools, if you need to reframe that relationship, because, you know, if you work together, that can be really, really powerful, and it can make quite a difference in terms of what you can get done and get in place for a young person. Okay, so some pitfalls, just some examples really to avoid. I've talked through some of these already. So, but you know, so for example, if the EHC plan states 25 hours of TA time, but the funding doesn't reflect this, it's not great. It's basically just putting everybody in a difficult situation. The next example here, this happens quite a lot actually between primary and secondary transition. So if your child is receiving more than is funded, so say for example, your child is, I had one of these very recently, child in a primary setting with an EHCP. EHCP funding probably would have paid for about, oh, I don't know, maybe 5 hours of support or something like that, or some intervention or something like that. But in actual fact, this child was receiving full-time one-to-one, including social time, because they needed it. And the primary school, which had a bit more flexibility, and primary schools quite often do, you know, were just providing it, but it wasn't being properly documented at the annual review. It wasn't taken to the local authority, and this had gone on for a number of years. And then all of a sudden, they're transferring to secondary school, and the secondary provision has read what's in the EHCP and what's in the previous reviews, and has no idea that actually this child is going to need more than that, or this comes to light very late in the summer term, at which point it's very, you know, the secondary school is put in a very difficult position because they haven't got the funding or the staff then to support this child. And all it does is it creates a very difficult situation. So if you know that you've got a child in primary school and they are receiving a lot more support than is stated in their education, health and care plan, you need to make sure really that is properly documented, and that it's taken to the local authority, and that the funding is updated, provision updated to reflect what is required. And yeah, third one there I think is self-explanatory. Okay, so transitions from primary to secondary and secondary to post-16. And just to let you know, so it's 11 o'clock, so I'm going to probably talk about this section for about another 5 to 10 minutes, and then we're going to pause for some Q&A, and then after that we've got one last section on co-production. Okay, so I hope everybody's holding up there. All right, so transitions from primary to secondary and secondary to post-16. So obviously annual review should happen annually every year, and you know it's fine for it to happen at roughly the same time every year, most years. However, okay, it is worth, in a transition year, a transfer year, you need to know that really the reviews tend to need to happen earlier, okay, or by a particular date, whenever your annual time is. So for example, this academic year, for anybody transferring, I think, from early years to primary and primary to secondary, there was a statutory deadline of the 15th of February, okay, and that was nationally, for local authorities to finalise education, health and care plans, all right, so that they specified the types of placements for September, all right. And for secondary school to post-16, it was the 31st of March. It's the 31st of March. So in order for local authorities to be able to do that, really, okay, the terminology here changed a little bit. Sometimes they're called phase transfer reviews, sometimes they're called transition reviews, all right. really those reviews need to have happened then by the 22nd of November, okay, or by the 7th of January 2021 for young people moving to post-16 placements. All right, so if you're in the position where you've got a child who's transferring and you haven't yet had your annual review, you need to get onto it straight away, I would suggest. Okay, because if you're requesting amendments, and quite often, as we've discussed already, you probably will need to be thinking about amendments, and again, I'll talk about that in a little bit more detail in a second, then, you know, you want those amendments to go through smoothly. Hopefully, after the annual review report is completed by the school and the minutes are completed by the school, and maybe you will have had a case officer at that transition review, the local authority will come back and update the education healthcare plan and will name the setting that you would like. But if they don't, you would possibly then need to appeal, and you need to, you know, there needs to be enough time to do that so that your child isn't placed in a setting too late. And also there can be a bit of a logjam with the tribunal sort of in between sort of February and the summer. So definitely I would say that if you've got a child or young person who's transferring between early years and primary to secondary, or secondary to post-16, and they haven't had their annual review for this year yet, get onto the school straight away. Okay, and again, when you're going into a transition year, a transfer year, think quite carefully about the purpose of the education health and care plan review. I mean, you can think about this for any of the reviews each year, but I think it's particularly important at this point. So obviously you're going to be trying to ensure an appropriate setting for your child, appropriate provision, okay? It might be a specific school, it might be specialist provision. You're probably going to be requesting some amendments to the plan because you're going to be thinking about what your child is going to need in that new setting. And it's going to be different, isn't it, to the current setting? You know, if you think about the difference between primary school and secondary school, and again, you can work with the setting that you're going to, or you would like to go to get their ideas on this, and they should be very open to that because, you know, ultimately it helps them as well. You need to ensure that the funding is appropriate, and you need to ensure that the plan is going to continue. And I've just also linked you there to a checklist on Send Legal, that website I was telling you about before, about EHC plans and requests, and that gives a very comprehensive list. More I've included here. So what I would also suggest before you get to the point of transition is that you do your research as a parent. So if possible, visit all of the potential placements. Now, obviously that isn't possible at the moment, but lots of settings are doing, you know, virtual meetings, open days, you know, and I would suggest that most people at this stage have got themselves up and running. And if they haven't got themselves up and running, is there a reason for that? You know, you need to be really thinking about, depending on which phase it is, you know, how inclusive this particular setting is. Check specifically what they can offer against the current needs and provisions of your child. Now, it's unlikely that they might say, well, I can't tell you, you know, specifically for your child. I can't, because they'll be wary to promise anything without looking at your child's paperwork properly or responding to a proper consultation. But you could talk to them generally about what they provide and what types of children they have there, what types of needs are they used to working with, and take notes, okay? Because the point of this is if the local authority then name a setting that you don't want, okay, you need to be in a position where you've got the evidence to dismiss those alternatives that you feel are not appropriate. You need to be able to evidence why. Okay, so that's why it's worth doing this research. It's not just to select the school that you'd like to be named, but also to dismiss the alternatives. All right, so I would go in with like a list of questions and ask each setting the same questions and make my notes. So I approach it in quite a business-like manner. Okay, some ideas then around primary to secondary and what to consider. All right, so first of all, it's about ensuring, isn't it, that the provision is adequate for your child. All right, so really thinking about sometimes I work with families and they are, you know, the situation is a little bit borderline. Their child could potentially be offered a special school setting, or they potentially could go into the mainstream, and it's making that call. So there's a lot to think about, isn't there, these transitions, and it's very emotional. Other things to be aware of, you know, so secondary schools, as I've already alluded to with that example before, are larger. Quite often they're a little less flexible in their, it's not about their ethos or their philosophy being less flexible, it's just simply they've got so many more children that they have to deal with, and it needs to be sort of quite rigid. So a smaller primary school setting has got sort of more flexibility in the school day, sometimes with their staff, you know. So many times I've worked with parents, and they said, well, you know, my child just used to just have some time out and go to the head's office and sit in the swivelly chair and swivel around and have just have that time out they needed. Well, that's great, I suppose, but, you know, is that evidenced as part of their provision? Is that something they need? What are they going to need at the secondary school? What's going to happen if they're not coping with the rigidity of the school day? What's going to happen if they become overstimulated and need some deregulation time? You know, where can they go? Who will support them? What does that need to look like? How is it going to be funded? Okay, so really think through, what is the school day like in this secondary setting? Okay, talk to the SENCO at the school, talk to teachers at the school. What is the day-to-day experience like for children? What will your child need to be able to manage that successfully? Okay. And then from there, it's about thinking about effective transition in terms of, once you've actually selected a school, what's going to help them, what will they do in terms of helping to induct them and transition them in the best possible way, because change is very difficult for lots of children, but particularly if you've got a child with complex needs. So what sort of induction visits will they do? Will they be flexible about that? Will they allow extra visits if necessary? You know, are they familiar with the types of resources that are going to help? You know, for example, social stories if your child's autistic. You know, have a big selection of resources already available. Have they got, you know, videos and pictures of all the staff? You know, are they set up? Will there be a key person, you know, that your child will be able to go with and start to form a relationship with straight away? You know, it might not be from primary to secondary that they'll necessarily have the same, depends on their needs, but it might be that they might not have the same learning support assistant or teaching assistant, if that's part of their provision, you know, consistently in the same way as they did at primary school, perhaps. You know, it might be that because of the way the school has to organise themselves with the funding and the provision, they work with different people. You know, if that's the case, you know, how's that going to work for your child? Is there any work around it if it's not going to work? Because if that is the way the school is working and there is no wiggle room, you know, it's worth you knowing about that. And I'm not saying that that's not something that couldn't be solved or talked about, and, you know, but I suppose the point is, again, we're talking about in the real world. You know, what does it look like now? How are the school operating? What you're looking for is the setting that you're going to be able to work with, those people you're going to be able to work with to get the best provision in place for your child. Secondary to post-16, it's quite similar, but again, you know, the school day, college day can look very, very different. Okay, sometimes, and colleges, from my experience, have very, very different resources as well. So sometimes a college will have a really brilliant package of funding where they're able to provide every child who's coming in with an EHCP with a laptop, for example, or some other specialist equipment. Okay, sometimes they'll have key, you know, sort of key people, key workers available. Other times they won't have very much at all. So really do your homework. All right, and I think the other thing to say about this as well when you're in a transition phase is that the current setting can invite any college representatives or any secondary school representatives to the annual reviews in, say, so if you, for example, if your child is in primary school, I send a representative of my team to year 5 and year 6 reviews if we think that a child is going to come to my school, and you can do that, and you can ask the school to do that. Okay, so effective transitions. What are the ingredients of effective transitions? Well, clear discussion of goals for transition with the current placement. So the setting where your child is currently, you know, they know your child well in a school setting. You know your child at home. And it's really important to talk about both of your perspectives and to think about what they need, what's going to suit them. There's lots of people who will have experience both at the school and at the local authority. They quite often have a careers service. You know, really take advantage of the experience and the knowledge of those key people in terms of next phase transitions. Like I've said, the current setting should support with introductions. So, you know, getting representatives to attend those annual reviews, potentially planning meetings once a placement has been specified. Pre-visits, acclimatisation, either in the real world or virtual. You might need several of these depending on your child's needs. Communication and provision to the child or young person, addressing any specific concerns. And again, this communication might need to happen in different ways, mightn't it? Through, say, social stories or other means. Sometimes you're going to need very clear individualised plans in place to support complex social, medical or cognitive needs. I mean, you know this, but particularly, you know, if your child has got a very specific medical need, you know, that's something that has got to be thought through very, very carefully. There's got to be a number of stakeholders involved in that planning. It doesn't tend to be something that can just happen overnight. That's why this lead-in time, this is why, you know, by February, really schools, colleges should know who's coming to them so that planning can start to happen early. Right, I'm going to pause there for some questions. So I think I will ask Sandra if it's okay to make it a little bit more interactive, if you're able to read some of those questions to me and I'll try and answer. Is that okay?
Yeah, we have 34 questions in total. So first one, does the local authority have a legal time frame to update the education, health and care plan?
Yes, so 4 weeks after the report is when the local authority need to update the education, health and care plan. Now, there are sometimes some cases where, so for example, if the local authority write to you and they are refusing to make the amendments that you would like, that you've asked for, or they're proposing other amendments, there is again here like another process that you can then follow. Now again, I've said I'm not a solicitor or a legal expert, and you'd have to have a look, and I'd suggest that you have a look at the Sen Legal website, because I think this is set out quite clearly there. But basically there is something where you then need to write back to the local authority and you need to ask them to, if they haven't already, to specify what amendments they're proposing to make, or their evidence for not making those amendments. And then, so basically there's a new time frame that kicks off from that point. So there's 4 weeks in the first instance, but then if it's not been, you know, if it's not been resolved, and sometimes I think that can go, I think it's for up to 8 weeks, so then it's 12 weeks in total. So it is worth you know, thinking about that particularly, and this is why it's really important for the transfer or transition reviews to get those reviews in early in the academic year. because if you think about it, if you're, you know, if you put your review paperwork in sort of November, end of November, December, then the local authority have got to come back to you by January. You know, the more time goes on, the later it goes on, the later you can end up in the academic year where you're having to try and resolve things.
Okay. What action can we take as parents when the local authority did not update our child's education, health and care plan?
Okay, well, you can email them. You may have done that already. If you're sort of more, if you're getting really frustrated and local authority are not responding to parental emails or calls, and you know, you followed their complaint procedure or whatever else, or you don't want to bother with that because it's just drawing it out, you can get a solicitor to send a pre-action letter for you. You would have to pay for that, but in my experience, if you're having a really difficult time getting things sorted, in my experience, that can resolve things pretty quickly. So, I mean, basically what you're saying there is you're essentially saying that we're threatening to go to tribunal but you're doing it through a solicitor, which makes them take it seriously. It's called a pre-action letter. And again, if you have a look at that Send Legal website, then you can do that. I mean, the other thing you can do, I mean, like I've said, is if they're refusing to update, you know, you've got actually an automatic right of appeal. So you can just start to go down the tribunal route if you want to.
Okay. Should the provisions stated in a child's education, health and care plan in section F still be delivered during lockdown, whether they are in school or staying at home? Yes is the answer. Like I said before, it might look different. You know, so obviously if schools, if you made a decision that you're keeping your child at home during an understandable decision during the lockdown period, it might look different, but you should be offered some way to fulfill that provision. So for example, you know, like I said before, I've got a speech and language therapist doing some work with some of my children who are entitled to that. I've also got some motor skills, remote motor skills sessions happening. So for example, you know, one of my higher level teaching assistants who usually facilitates the motor skills one-to-one with a young person in my setting who's got an EHCP. What they're doing is they've set up a Teams meeting, so video call each week, and the child and their mum are doing the motor skills work with the TA directing them. So we've got, you know, we've made sure that it's happening, and we're supporting the child and the parent at home to make sure that provision carries on. Okay.
So yes.
A review cover.
Sorry, can you say that again?
What must a review cover?
What must a review cover? Well, if you go back to some of those previous slides when you get the presentation, you know, there's a list there of what needs to be covered, but ultimately you need to make sure, I would say, that you are reviewing the provision that's in place and the progress that the child has made as a result of that provision. Now, obviously, progress looks different depending on the child, but for example, if your child's in a mainstream school, I think it should include the academic progress as well as progress against the specific outcomes that have been written into the education, health and care plan. And those outcomes should be reviewed and updated so that they're appropriate for the next phase of the child's education, the next academic year.
Okay.
And I would say that's the minimum of what should be in the education, health and care plan review.
What reports would you expect to be provided prior to the annual review?
Okay, so I would expect So again, we covered this earlier in the presentation, but basically I would expect that you would have a report from the school. So it might be an academic progress report. You may have attendance. You may have, if the school has anything like behaviour or praise points, they might include something like that. You might have a report from a learning support assistant or teaching assistant who's been supporting your child. And you would have any specialist reports. So for example, if your child has been working with an NHS speech and language therapist, that speech and language therapist would also provide a report demonstrating what they've been working on and the progress the child has made and their recommendations. So yeah, that's what should be provided. But that, I mean, just to say that again, every local authority sets out different guidelines, so there isn't a sort of national checklist, but that is basically what I would say needs to be provided. You need something where you can look at your child's progress, and you need any specialist reports.
Narratives from teachers are often worded so as to almost exclude reference to my child's special needs and diagnosed conditions. That can't be right, can it?
So what was the first bit? Was it a report from a teacher?
Narratives from teachers.
So just to be clear, schools, they need to, especially secondary schools, they need to make sure that they obviously get feedback from teaching staff as to how. So I'm talking about, say, secondary mainstream, okay? Obviously, your child's going to have a number of different teachers and they need to get feedback from those teachers. What some schools do is that they ask those teachers to write something. So I'm wondering if that's the narrative that you're referring to here. No, I mean, a secondary teacher should have knowledge, of course, of your child's needs and disabilities, because otherwise how can they possibly cater for them and provide an inclusive classroom environment. But just to be clear, that there's nothing anywhere that says that these narratives have to be written or provided. So what I would say is, again, common sense, real world sort of approach would be, if you're going to parents' evening or you're having a conversation with a teacher and they don't seem to know about your child's needs or disabilities, I would ask them, do they know? And what are they doing to support them? Because they should do. And it's obviously it's the school's responsibility to ensure that all of their staff have access to a child's key information, and teachers should be thinking about that and should be adapting their lessons accordingly. I don't know if I've answered that question perfectly for you, because I'm not entirely sure of the context, but I hope that helps.
My young person has an additional diagnosis of PDA, which needs to be added into it at the annual review. I feel that the old reports don't really reflect this, as it's so specialised. Can I ask for a new EP report?
So you're asking for an educational psychologist report. Well, it's a tricky one, this. Again, I'm assuming this is a mainstream state school. I don't know the situation. EP hours are like gold dust, and if a school has got a lot of children on SEND support that need to be assessed, and they've got children who've already got education, health and care plans, and have got, say, an external assessment for PDA, they may not want to prioritise that to use their educational psychology hours, which might not be the answer that you want to hear. A school isn't beholden, to have to do that. But what you could do is you could write to the local authority and you could request that they provide that. The other thing is, if you've got an external, because presumably you know, you've got this as a diagnosis. I don't know. If you've got that as an external diagnosis, you could ask for that to be accepted and by the local authority, and then included in the section of the EHCP which talks about your child's needs, so that it's, you know, it's clearly current and updated.
Okay. We are currently in one local authority area, but my daughter moves to sixth form in September and wants to go to a college in a different local authority. Is this an issue?
It shouldn't be, you know, if we but in the real world it can sometimes be. It depends on her needs and the provision that she requires. So the types of issues that can sometimes arise are when you've got so if your child, say for example, needs something like occupational therapy or speech and language therapy that's being provided by the local authority, if they attend a setting in a different local authority, it can be really hard for that setting to access the specialist therapies. It shouldn't be. You know, again, the local authority are accountable and have responsibility to provide that, and it doesn't matter which local authority you go to school in. But in the real world, it often is it's impossible to access that for the child. And that's I'm speaking as a, you know, with my Senko hat on. You know, you'll be ringing, you'll be contacting, you'll be emailing, and you're getting nothing back. And in my experience, it's easier if they're in the same local authority. But having said that, if your daughter, you know, isn't in receipt of any of those types of specialist therapies, you know, it should be absolutely fine. It should be fairly straightforward.
Okay. Reprogress reports, should we expect to see them on an interim basis, or is this only a requirement of schools on an annual basis?
Well, I mean, I would say that you would, I mean, it very much depends on the school systems and policies, as I suppose, and the setting as to what you're going to be looking at with a progress report. So if you're in a primary school setting, you know, it will possibly be easier to pull together a progress report termly if the school's not doing that already. Most schools in the primary setting do. In the secondary setting, if the school isn't set up for providing a termly report, it could be difficult, could be more challenging, certainly, for the school Senko to get all of that information on a termly basis for you, but not impossible. And certainly the code of practice is clear that you are, you know, really you should be, you know, not receiving 3 reviews a year, that's wrong, but just sort of being able to have a review of what's happening and some sort of contact about 3 times a year about termly. So I think I can't remember exactly how the question was worded now, but I think, yes, you should be receiving some update on progress more often than just annually. I would say it should be termly.
Okay. Should we be asked to contribute in advance to be distributed 2 weeks prior to the review meeting?
That's a really good question, isn't it? I don't think it's really set out that clearly. Usually, I think most schools probably send out when they invite you to the meeting, they send you your parents' views. So if the school is super organised and, well, just organised and is sending, you know, you notice of about a month or more in advance of that, if you can get your parent views back to be circulated to everybody, then that's very helpful. I don't think there's any sort of statutory requirement for that, if that's what you're asking. But I don't see why you couldn't request that if you felt that it would be useful. I mean, on the flip side, you know, there's a lot of parents that don't fill out that paperwork and bring it on the day, or, you know, just they don't do it at all. and you have to go through the questions with them on the day, and that can be for lots of reasons, again, about accessibility, etc. But no, it's not a requirement.
Due to COVID-19, I don't know who our contact with the local authority is. Should there have been a post EHCP meeting?
With the local authority?
Yeah.
No, I mean, I don't think you'd have a post EHCP meeting with a member of the local authority necessarily, but you should know who your local authority representative is, ideally. I would contact the local authority and ask. So again, they're all called different things, but like you send services, there should be a general email. Or failing, like, ask the school SENCO, do they know who the local authority caseworker is? And I would be getting their email address so that you've got it, and maybe send them an email just to check. I think it's always worth having that information, knowing who that person is.
Okay. Do you have to attend the meeting if your child is in primary school?
Do you have to attend the annual review meeting? Well, yes, I mean, I would suggest that you should. I think it'd be very difficult to have an annual review without a parent present. I mean, if you've got two parents and you don't both have to attend, but you generally need a parent there. I mean, I'm not sure again of the context of this question. It could be all sorts of things. You know, I have heard awful stories of, you know, schools saying we're having the annual review, you know, on this date, not giving parents any option at all to change it. And obviously and then going ahead and doing the annual review, and that they shouldn't and can't really, should not do that at all. Flip side, have had situations where you've set up the annual review and parents have cancelled several times, sometimes at late notice. And you know, you get to a point where, well, we need to have this annual review, but I would say you can't really have an annual review without a parent there.
Should there be minutes and a report for the annual review? All the ones I have attended, the SENCO amends in the local authorities system, Liquid Logic, which goes to the LA to accept and reject. Okay. So again, I'm not 100%. So I wonder if this person is saying that they're not seeing reports or minutes prior to the SENCO doing this. Do you think that's what they're saying, Sandra? Possibly, or could they be saying that should they be available after the annual review as well? So I would say that minutes or a report of some kind, what a lot of schools do is they use the local authority's annual review paperwork and then they fill in what was discussed at the meeting using that paperwork. Other schools just write their own minutes, like a record of the conversation. And I would say that as a parent, you need to have seen that and have agreed it before it's then updated. If the SENCO has to update it on Liquid Logic, which is like a sort of sharing software system, I haven't heard of this happening quite in this way before, but then, you know, nothing surprises me in this area. I think that probably what should happen is that whatever sections have to be filled in on the Liquid Logic should be representative with what the parent sees. And yeah, I think you should be able to request, I suppose, a screenshot or something of what's gone to the local authority. If that's what you're asking, I think you should be able to lay eyes on that. The parents just come back for clarification. Yeah. All I see is the amended EHCP and no minutes. No, she should know what's being sent to the local authority.
and she should have an opportunity to say, you know, yes, I agree, that's what we said, or no, I don't agree, that's not what we said. Because obviously, you know, it's your child's education, health and care plan. The school are going to put down, they may well put down their views. You may not always 100% agree with school. It's not about coming to complete and utter agreement on everything, but you should definitely see what's going to be sent to the local authority.
Okay.
So if you're not receiving a report or minutes or something, you're well within your rights to ask for that.
Re-annual reviews. As school take the minutes and write the report and send to the local authority, should there be an opportunity for parents to make a final amendment to make sure we're completely happy in agreement?
So can you read that again for me? Sorry.
Re-annual reviews. As school take the minutes and write the report and sent to the local authority, should there be an opportunity for parents to make a final amendment to make sure we're completely happy or in agreement?
Yes, in terms of the fact that I think you should, like I said in the last question, you need to be have seen it, and if you want to make an amendment, then yes, I think you speak to the SENCO. What can this? I mean, obviously, it's very context specific, this sort of thing, and you know, sometimes what can happen in a meeting is that people think they've agreed something, and then when you look at it later, you think, oh, actually, I don't think I was on the same page with them. And again, this is why I think it's really important to have a good relationship with the school and with the SENCO, and for both parties to be working on that. And just perhaps be aware that sometimes school, it might be a genuine misunderstanding or miscommunication or whatever. So the answer to that is yes, absolutely, because that's the whole point of you seeing the minutes and the report, isn't it? To check if you agree or disagree or want to amend something. Or maybe you've gone away and thought about it again. But beware of, I suppose, if you've gone away and thought about it and changed your mind, but you've had an hour's meeting about something, you can't then expect to have another separate meeting just with a SENCO on the phone and completely change something, because that sort of negates the point of the annual review. And that's why I think it's so important as parents to really prepare for the annual reviews and really think about what you think before you get there. And then, you know, obviously, you know, when you're in that meeting, things can change, but to be very, very prepared and sort of present in that review, so that the review really does represent, you know, everybody's views and co-production.
What about preparing for adulthood on annual review meetings? Who writes them or contributes to them?
Okay, well, sometimes what can happen is that the local authority has a careers representative actually who may also attend the annual review, and that can be quite helpful. Also, just thinking about things like, so the school might offer certain interventions or provisions, such as things like travel training. So that might be that's something that we offer to all of our young people with education, health and care plans at sort of post year 9, depending on their stage of development. So, you know, who contributes? Well, everybody contributes. I mean, this is also an area, I think, where parents, you know, can really support and help. So, you know, obviously we might be asking them to feedback on, you know, can the young person, you know, make a simple meal, make themselves some toast or a cup of tea or whatever. You know, there may be things to work on in terms of, say, I don't know, their self-care, organising themselves. Again, depends on their needs, doesn't it? But I think everybody has a role to play in that, but definitely school, definitely parents, and it might also be that there's you know, somebody like from the local authority coming from a careers or post-16 standpoint that can also be brought in to make suggestions in that area.
At secondary school, I haven't ever experienced a good review. Only now, at end of year 10 into year 11, is the EHCP from primary school being updated.
Okay, well that's awful. I'm so sorry that that's been your experience. I mean, presumably from this you're saying that it's being updated now. But I mean, I think I would be tempted to be writing to the local authority and making a complaint about that. So I'm assuming that it is being updated now, or it has been updated now, so it's current and representative. But if not, I would suggest that you really do need to get onto that as a parent and make sure that they do it for all of the reasons that I've discussed through the webinar. It's really important that it's appropriate.
In our upcoming review, I know school are going to state that COVID has impacted. There have been no interventions provided, and we have just moved to year 7. Feel we are a bit lost. Where do we stand on this?
It's, you know, it's very tricky. And again, it's difficult not knowing the whole story to advise, but all I can say is what I said before, really, which is that this time around, you know, schools should be providing something. Well, they should be providing what's in section F ultimately. Where, so say for example, your child would normally be in receipt of learning support assistant support, something like that. You know, I wonder, you know, would it be helpful for, if your child's at home, I'm assuming they are, would it be helpful, for example, for that learning support assistant to ring your child a couple of times a week to them, you know, about how they're managing with the remote learning? Or the other thing that we've been able to, we've got some live lessons going on at our school, and the learning support assistants are logging on to are in those live lessons as well. They're actually supporting children remotely in the lessons, and we've also got some breakout rooms going on where they might go into like a remote breakout room and they can be having an additional conversation and something them, you know, with completion of the learning that's happening in that particular lesson. There are all sorts of things that schools can do, you know, to support children and, you know, uphold that provision in section F. So if you've not, I mean, we are, what is it? Are we a week into lockdown? I can't remember. The minute the announcement happened, my holiday was over and I was back in school. So schools didn't have a lot of time. They didn't have a lot of warning. It is still quite early. I wonder if perhaps just dropping the SENCO an email and asking what's going to be in place gently to start with perhaps would be appropriate. And then if nothing's forthcoming, perhaps being a little bit more robust in your approach, say from the middle of next week, would be appropriate. But definitely schools should be providing some support as per section F.
Would a primary school child be expected to attend a review, or would that be secondary?
I think a primary school child could attend a review, definitely. I think it depends on the child, depends on how old they are, depends on how confident they are, depends on their needs. You know, I mean, if you've got a 5-year-old, perhaps it's, you know, it's not appropriate, but if they are, you know, 8, 9, 10, perhaps more appropriate, but it can depend on all sorts of things. But there's no reason why they couldn't attend unless there's a reason.
Okay.
I'm just conscious of time, Sandra. We've got about 11 minutes left, haven't we? How many more questions have we got waiting? So we've got a final section of the webinar to go through.
Yeah, there's quite a few. I can email the rest of the questions to you if we don't get round to answering them all. Okay.
I mean, the other thing is we've got until 12:15, haven't we? Is that right?
Yeah.
Okay. All right. So I'll tell you what, why don't we do I'm just thinking about people who perhaps have only got till 12 o'clock because that's when it was advertised till. I'm wondering about moving back, just do the last section of the presentation, which is just about co-production. So it might be useful for people. I perhaps won't spend as long on the section as I would normally, perhaps just 10 minutes to get us to 12 o'clock. And then I'm happy to stay on for another 15 minutes and answer further questions if that's of help.
Yeah, that'll be fine.
Is that okay? All right, brilliant. Okay, so I'm going to move into the next section of the presentation. Final section, so co-production. All right, so what this means, what does it mean? So co-production happens when all partners together design, develop and carry out review recommendations, plans, actions and materials as a collective. And I think we heard from people earlier, you know, what it feels like when you have a good review, when you've really got co-production going on, and people were talking about really feeling like they've been listened to, like they're all working together, the child was at the centre, that, you know, you felt like everybody knew the child well. You know, all of these things are, you know, the outcomes of effective co-production. Now, I think it's really important also to include the child or young person in this. So it's nice to see so many questions about children being involved. And obviously, the older they get, the more effective and appropriate this becomes. And I actually, I spent some time talking to some young people. I've talked to some year 9 and 10 students recently about what they thought it meant. And this is what they said. They said everyone being on an equal footing, producing something together, listening to each other, agreeing and compromising. And I thought that was pretty astute of this group of young people, actually. Really, you know, very clear. And it should, this idea of really centralising the experience of the child or young person. And I think this is really important for us to focus on, because I think so often we get very caught up in our own emotions about our child or about the young person as a professional that we're supporting, and that actually we really need to bring it back to what is happening for the child, not what are we filtering, but what is happening for them. What is it like to be in their shoes? Is the provision working for them? How do they feel? You know, is it helping them make progress, but is it helping them feel confident about what they're doing? Do they feel happy? Do they feel that they've got friends? You know, and they're having positive interactions in the school day. These things are really, really important. It's about the child. So working, it puts the child at the centre. And I think quite often there's a misconception that production is just about the school and the parents working together. And I'm really keen that we think about this, you know, in this way with the child as well. And this is a slide that I think is quite interesting to look at and just consider it. Really. The idea, I'm not going to read it all out, it's there for you to have a look at. You'll have the slides afterwards, obviously, but to think about as parents, you know, the different elements that everybody can bring to the dynamic. So as a parent, you are an expert on your child, on what works and what doesn't work. I would say, you know, a little bit of a disclaimer there, that's at home, of course, and if you haven't seen them in the school setting, perhaps you don't know how they present always to other people. I know my own daughter, I'm sometimes really surprised by some things that schools tell me, and that's how we all are. We're all different in different environments, so it's really important to all listen to each other, and to try and sort of dispel any power imbalances that are there, that we're on an equal footing. Experience of the system, skill or professionalism as well. Quite often I see fellow professionals who have got children who've got complex, and they say it's amazing how, you know, obviously the professionals at the school may not know that they have got, you know, expertise in a particular area of SEND, and when they find out, sometimes attitudes seem to change. I think is really sad, really terrible. But, you know, this is a slide that I show to professionals quite often, because I really want to highlight, you know, the power that parents bring to the dynamic. We know that the right home environment makes a massive difference to outcomes, both positive and negative. Parents have the ability to jointly agree, support and review plans, and that's what we've been talking about today. And they have the ability to support professionals. And again, we've been talking about that today. So I won't talk through all of the other elements in the SENCO and the child area, but they're there for you to have a look and think about. Okay, this was just an example of one young person's journey. It was co-production in practice. Carmen was a young lady who I worked with for about 7 years, and she had cerebral palsy, was cognitively very, very able, but we had to make a number of adaptations, and it was very much a journey that we all went on together. SENCO parents, learning support assistant as well, but Carmen was very much at the centre, and you know, she changed as obviously as she grew up, and her needs changed, and we had to respond. And this is just a sort of a snippet of some of the things that we did that had a positive impact for Carmen, but that she's very much a part of. And she's now at university, which is wonderful. Okay, so some principles for effective co-production: keep things student-centred, open and positive conversations, mutual respect, remaining mindful of the professional-parent relationship, being solution-first, thinking together about overcoming solutions. Sometimes it's not easy on either side, and you've got to really work together to try and find those solutions. Being realistic and practical within the setting, so being in the real world, anticipating issues and planning ahead as a team. So, you know, if you need to sit down and plan if a trip's coming up and your child's going to go on the trip, you know, you might need a number of planning meetings ahead of time. It's not going to be good for anybody to be sort of planning it at the last minute. And sorry, that's not come out very well on my screen. I hope it's come out better on yours. But trying to see the bigger picture. So in a 7-year period, things are going to go wrong sometimes. You may have had lots of meetings and talked things through and made agreements, and then it doesn't quite happen as it should have done. And sometimes that's not the fault of the SENCO or the school. It might be the fault of an individual teacher who didn't read an email or hadn't responded, or just, you know, wasn't at the top of their game that day, and mistakes happen. You don't want mistakes happening all of the time. They obviously shouldn't happen to the detriment of a child's, you know, needs repeatedly. And obviously if there's a medical issue, you know, that could be really dangerous. But it's about sometimes not sweating the small stuff and keeping the bigger picture in mind, and being able to, you know, feed back to the school, this didn't happen, but not necessarily always in a confrontational way, and being quite understanding of sort of the impact that different people can have. Okay, so again, reframing meetings. So for everybody in the room, everybody in the partnership, seeking out the skills of each person within the child's team and utilising them. You know, a parent might be absolutely brilliant at doing something that the SENCO isn't. So it's sort of about, you know, really like you would at work, working out who's gonna do what, you know, and taking things on and really working together. So recognise that working as a team doesn't always mean that each person does the same amount of work, but very often it's the child who's got the biggest workload and or challenges. That's so important for us all to remember, isn't it? Actively addressing any power imbalance within the child's team right at the start, working together as equals. So I will often try and address that as a SENCO. You know, if you're a parent and the SENCO doesn't quite seem to get that, there might be a way to talk to them, you know, in a non-confrontational way about the way in which you'd love the relationship, the working relationship to work, referring to yourselves as a team. You know, sometimes just to bear in mind that, you know, SENCOs, especially newly appointed SENCOs, haven't got that much experience. They could be quite afraid of these meetings, especially you could have a lot more experience than them. So the way in which you come across is important in terms sometimes of putting them at their ease. And again, you know, yes, they're the professional, yes, they're the person paid to do the job, but this is the real world, and people are at different phases of their own development. So you work with what you've got, and you do the best to get the most out of what you've got in front of you and the people that are working with you. So being open to different perspectives, I think, is really important. Trying to acknowledge or empathise with past experiences of all within the child's team. And this is something I say to professionals and new Senkos all the time. You know, it's important that you recognise that this parent has got a history here of sometimes battling really hard to get everything that they needed to get for their child. It's not been easy. They're going to bring stuff with them, you know, and, you know, ask them about that and learn about that history, because it will help you to work with them more effectively. But equally offering fresh starts while being aware and reflective, okay? Being mindful of different forms of communication styles. So that's for everybody. Not everybody communicates in the same way. Sometimes professionals have, you know, have needs and social communication difficulties too, okay? So it's for everybody. Being open to asking parents questions. This is for a professional, such as what can I do to support you? Not being afraid to say I don't know, or could you help me with X? And again, that's very much that's for everybody, but it's for Senko as well. And whilst remaining realistic, being available to discuss concerns, to debrief before or after meetings, and to continue to trial routes of communication until something works. Because sometimes it really is about trial and error, and I think it's about acknowledging that when we're working, you know, in this way. Let's try this, let's review it. You know, if it's not working, we'll try something different, or let's give it a bit longer, let's see if we can get it working. Okay, and again, this idea of really working together as a team. Okay, I'm going to just not go through this now, but it's there for any professionals that we've got here. Some really good tips. Okay, and that is the end of the presentation. So what we can do now is, we've got another sort of 15 minutes or so, hopefully get through any remaining questions.
Okay. Is it okay for parents to put in an education, health and care plan, since the school is suggesting that my child is doing well and progressing on the top-up funding?
So what was the first bit of the question, sorry?
Is it okay for parents to put in an education, health and care plans?
I'm wondering, are we talking, when they're saying put in, do you think they're talking about applying for one, asking for assessment? Yeah. Yes, it is. I mean, okay, so this is an area that I deal with quite a lot. Ideally, you want to work with the school, but quite often schools and parents get to a bit of an impasse, and there's so many reasons why, which I'm not going to go into now. But basically, yes, as a parent, you can write to local authority and you can request an assessment for an education, health and care plan. What the local authority though will then do is write to the school and ask them for evidence. Now, if the school are saying there is no evidence and the child's progressing well, and you disagree, you know, you're at a bit of an impasse there. And sometimes then what the local authority will do is they will just reject the request for assessment. Now, if that then happens, you can then go down an appeal route. Okay, and what will probably happen is that you'll be asked to attend a mediation session with the local authority and somebody from the school. And if there's no other way through this, and I'd recommend that that is the path that you choose. I've supported families through this process, and we've had outcomes where the child has then got an education, health and care plan. It can be, you know, it's not for everybody, but I think, you know, I think the first port of call is always to try and really work with the school. So you speak to the Senko, you speak to the class teacher, you speak to the head, you remind them of their duties, you show any evidence you've got of your child not making proper progress, you've got that documented, you show it to them, you show them that you're aware of the, you know, what the code of practice says, you so you have those conversations, those robust conversations with school first, but then if you're getting nowhere, then you can go down this pathway.
If your child has support from social services in the form of short breaks, should the review include a report from social services?
I think you could request that. There's nothing to say. Definitely social care representatives should be invited to the review, but there's nothing to say that they have to report, but you could request it.
When a child is included in an education, health and care plan review who hasn't previously been included, is there some degree of confidentiality with regard to past reviews or comments? For example, it may seem that parents may have commented on things that the child may have found embarrassing, like personal hygiene, inability to do basic tasks like tie shoelaces or cross a road, and it might appear to the child that parents are not on their side or may feel betrayed.
Yeah, so again, I think it's the it's the skill of the person chairing the meeting, isn't it, and the preparation that goes on beforehand that's so important here. So for example, I mean, I've had this sort of situation before in secondary setting. You obviously don't necessarily want to bring this up in front of the young person if it's going to, cause this type of this sort of outcome. So I would usually, in that case, have a section of the meeting that the child attends, and then they can go back to class or whatever. And then if there were some areas that are a little more sensitive, I wouldn't discuss them in front of the child. I would discuss them as a parent and professional. And again, I think it's about using common sense and judgment.
Is there a timeline guide you can share for transition to secondary from a parent perspective? Mainstream school applications deadline is something like the 31st of October. It would be useful to see how those link up.
I don't have anything like that. No, I mean, I've got on the EHCP website, you've got your annual review checklist. The Sen Legal website, I've got a few bits and pieces, but I don't think I haven't come across a specific timeline like that for transition for parents specifically. It would be a good idea, wouldn't it, to have one? And if I come across anything like that, I'll obviously pass it on to Seashell Trust to send out, but no, I haven't got anything specifically for that.
What is the process for transferring to higher education at 18 plus?
So, well, usually, but much the same really as if you've got a child who's going from GCSE to 16, but obviously there's a little bit more. Usually they're expected to be a little bit more independent, and again for parents to support. So I would still, you'd be preparing for this in advance. So you'd be talking about it most likely their year 12 and year 13 reviews. It might be that they will be provided with some support in terms of doing UCAS applications. And again, I would be thinking about, provision required, and really talking to the different universities, about what they provide. What's quite interesting is that at universities, they have quite a lot of funding to support young people. So quite often, the provision can be really very good. But obviously it's going to look very different, and is the young person going to be living independently? What's that going to look like? Do they need help with that? So it's a very similar process. I mean, as you probably know, the education, health and care plans go until a young person is 25 years old, and I guess it's about thinking about what's required. The other thing to think about here is quite often I've had young people say that they want to cease to maintain the plan when they're going to university. quite often, you know, that they're fairly high functioning with whatever their needs are, and they're academically able, and that they've become more aware of themselves, and they haven't wanted to maintain the plan because they felt that it's almost sometimes can feel like a negative thing for them. And I usually try to encourage them. Look, obviously, you know, if it's applicable for it to be cease to maintain, if they don't need support, then cease to maintain it, because obviously it's public money and that could be used for somebody else. But if I think that they will require some support, then I really do try and encourage them to keep it in place, because it's a flag for the university to really have a look at their needs and see what can be provided.
So we've got time for 2 more questions.
Yeah.
The EHCP has just been agreed and is being written, and the son is moving to secondary in September. Can we request a review to discuss transition? We don't know where he is going yet.
Yes, I think you could request a review, but I would suggest that might be part of your annual review. I mean, I think it's about trying to find out as much as possible about the different settings. And then if what you're talking about is to sort of have a specific meeting just to talk about those options through with the current setting, I think you could request that. And, you know, if somebody asked me for that, I would say, yeah, absolutely. You know, let's have a chat about it and let's talk about it, and maybe that'll help you make some decisions. But schools aren't required to do that as such, and certainly should be discussed as part of the EHCP review.
Do you have any advice on what to consider from early years to reception, what to get in place with EHCP, and what to consider from schools? Thank you. Okay.
Yeah. I mean, again, it very much it's all about looking at the needs of your child. So, for example, I suppose, you know, from experience, some children going from early years to reception might not be able to toilet independently. If your child's going to need to be in nappies, for example, still, and need to be changed, that's something that, you know, that personal care needs to be written into the plan. I would say that that's absolutely key. I would say also that you're looking at any specific, you know, interventions or specialist support that you'd want the local authority to provide. So if you think your child is going to need some speech and language therapy, make sure that's written into the plan. It's really about what you're trying to think about all the time with this is what outcomes are you trying to achieve? And what I mean by that is what should look different for your child as a result of the support that's in place. Okay, so what will they be able to access that they couldn't before? What will they be able to achieve that they couldn't before? And then think back, what needs to be in place to help that to happen? You know, does it need to be some speech and language therapy to enable them to communicate more effectively with their peers? Does it need to be I don't know, a social skills group if they're in secondary to do that? Does it need to be, you know, if they've got adult support in a classroom, does that help them to feel more confident? Does it allow them to, you know, achieve and access the learning more effectively? You know, what outcomes need to be written in, and then what does that provision need to look like in order to achieve those outcomes, to make that difference? And that's what you're looking for at any stage.
Okay, so I'd like to thank everybody for attending today. I hope it has been benefit to you all. The recording for the webinar will follow by email to all those that have booked on.
And I'd just like to say again, thank you very much. I mean, it's a little bit of a strange experience delivering when I can't see anybody, but I can see that just by having a look at the chat here that people have been really very active, and I really hope that this has been useful. Just to say, I can take you, right, okay, final bit here. There's some further information of some parent support services that I think are really useful. So have a look at those. You've got my details down there at the bottom, and you've also got my email address there as well. So if anybody has got any, in fact you haven't got my email address, but my email address is liz@spotlighteducationsupport.com. Obviously any remaining questions that you've already put into the chat, Sandra will send to me, and we'll try and get some answers back to you. But if you've got, you know, anything sort of that you want to ask about post this webinar, please do drop me a line. That's absolutely fine, and I'll do my best to come back to you. But thank you again for attending. I really hope it's been useful.